Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we really unpack complex topics, try and get to the essential insights. And today, you've brought us a pretty powerful collection of sources, all focused on the history of American slavery.
Indeed. Yeah, for this deep dive, we're drawing from, well, several places. Reports from the Equal Justice Initiative, they're focused on ending mass incarceration, racial injustice. Then there are the WPA slave narratives, which are just these incredible firsthand accounts from formerly enslaved people.
Oh, wow.
We also have academic analyses, Oxford University Press, documents via the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, and some investigative journalism, too.
Okay, so our mission today really is to cut through some of the maybe lingering myths and confront the stark realities of American slavery. We want to look at its brutal nature, the trauma, the lasting trauma inflicted, and this is crucial, how history itself got documented and sometimes actively distorted. We're going to explore how, a romanticized past often hides these horrifying truths, and why getting back to factual accounts is just so essential. You might even remember First Lady Michelle Obama's comment about waking up every morning in a house that was built by slaves.
Right, I remember the reaction to that.
Yeah, and that seemingly simple statement, it sparked this huge debate. You had commentators insisting enslaved people at the White House were, quote, well-fed and had decent lodgings provided by the government.
Mm-hmm. And that statement right there, that well-fed and decent lodgings, it just immediately shows how ingrained this sort of romanticized, diminished view of slavery has become. What's really striking is how persistent some narratives are, even when there's just overwhelming evidence pointing the other way.
And it's exactly those romanticized narratives we need to challenge. I mean, the sources we have are incredibly clear. American slavery wasn't benign, not at all.
Precisely. The Equal Justice Initiative, they actually define slavery as one of the world's worst mass atrocities. Globally, you're talking 12 million Africans kidnapped, enslaved, shipped across the Atlantic. Horrific conditions. Nearly 2 million died just during the sea journey.
2 million.
Yeah, and that transit, the Middle Passage, just for the people brought to North America, about 18% died during the voyage, at around 472,000.
It's almost impossible to even picture those conditions. Alada Equiano, he survived it, and he described ships so crowded people had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocating us. He talked about copious perspirations, these loathsome smells, sickness everywhere. He painted this picture of the galling of the chains, the sheer filth, children falling into waste tubs, the shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying. He said it made it a scene of horror almost inconceivable.
And if you connect that human horror to the business side of it.
Yes.
There's a letter. Robert Livingston, 1749. One of his ships arrived, having buried 37 slaves, and since 3 more and 2 more likely to die. That's how he put it.
Buried 37 slaves.
Yeah. And he calls it an accident not to be helped, his main concern. That there will not be much left, I fear, of their profits. That contrast.
Yeah.
The immense human suffering just seen as a line item on a ledger. It shows you the core dehumanization right there.
So the Middle Passage, just unimaginable horrors, but
Right.
that was only the start. What about the daily reality once someone arrived in America as an enslaved person?
Well, the sources all confirm American slavery was consistently dehumanizing, barbaric, often violent, brutal. Enslaved people were chained, beaten, humiliated, constantly denigrated. You had generations of black children born into bondage because slavery became hereditary specifically for black people in America. Enslaved women endured terrible sexual violence. Families lived under this constant threat of being torn apart, sold away. And the sources really stress that trying to deny these truths now is just continuing that historical effort to deny their basic humanity.
It's hard to fathom, but even after the Civil War ended slavery, there was this huge, deliberate effort to rewrite history, wasn't there?
Oh, absolutely. Southern whites used violence, discrimination, everything to construct a false narrative. They basically dominated public memory. They put up these tax-funded monuments, glorifying the Confederacy, claiming the war wasn't even about slavery. They pushed this image of enslaved people as, quote, happy, loyal, and faithful to slaveholders.
Happy and loyal.
Yeah, I mean, you even had newspaper editorials in 1901 calling for a fitting remembrance to those old, faithful black mammies and Uncle Remuses. And some of those monuments, they're still standing today. They physically embody that romanticized, completely false narrative.
That whole effort to romanticize it just clashes so violently with the actual physical and psychological toll. Let's really get into the reality of that suffering.
Yeah, and understanding this is key. The physical and psychological attacks were absolutely central to how slavery functioned. Things like branding or amputation, they became maybe less common by the late 1700s, but beating, That remained widespread, caused catastrophic trauma. The ex-slave narratives are just full of accounts of physical torture
Yeah.
by owners, overseers, sometimes even other enslaved people forced to do it.
So what did all that abuse actually do to their bodies, day in, day out?
Well, beyond the beatings, you had chronic conditions from just relentless overwork, terrible rations, not enough clothing. Frederick Douglass, for instance, he remembered winters barefoot, poorly clothed, getting frostbite. Constant hunger drove people to steal food, which then often meant more whippings.
Vicious cycle.
Exactly. And we see in the bones, too, archaeology, like from
Yeah.
African burial grounds in 18th century New York City. The skeletons, even of children, show signs of just excessive repetitive stress. Many children died young. There's evidence of anemia, osteomalacia, that's severe bone softening from poor diet, and these enlarged muscle attachments from constantly carrying heavy loads.
Okay, so those are the physical scars. What about the invisible ones, the psychological costs?
Oh, they were immense. And they affected everyone involved being enslaved, obviously, but also in a really warped way, the owners, too. Enslaved people were basically forced to perform submission, maintain a cheerful and submissive front, never show independent thought, never show the anger that violence naturally creates.
That constant suppression must have been.
Exactly. And that repression, it led to signs of trauma that you can even see in things like runaway slave ads. They describe people as stutterers, or always looking down, seeming depressed, drinking excessively, or having these sudden outbursts of fierce, uncontrollable rage. Many clearly suffered from what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome.
That's such a powerful, disturbing image of that hidden suffering. It really sounds like the system just corrupted everyone it touched.
It absolutely did. Harriet Jacobs, she was an enslaved woman, sexually preyed upon herself, and she summed it up so powerfully. She said, "Slavery is a curse to the whites as well as to the blacks. It makes the white fathers cruel and sensual, the sons violent and licentious. It contaminates the daughters and makes the wives wretched." That absolute power just bred sadism, sexual abuse. It caused immense pain even within the white families, like mistresses suffering from the constant adultery.
And for the enslaved, of course, the costs included the absolute basics like economic freedom.
That's right, absolutely fundamental. Enslaved people earned no wages. They couldn't save money. They had no legal right to own property. Even if a master, say, let a favored enslaved person use a cottage or a garden plot, that possession was always temporary, totally dependent on the owner's whim. Couldn't be passed down. And because they had no wages, no property, they couldn't do what many other immigrants did, which was send money back home to their villages in Africa. Education was also largely denied, especially in the South. Although some, like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs, they did manage to learn to read and write, often with help from owners or mistresses who saw some value in it. But even then, any skills they acquired, they primarily benefited the owner. They couldn't just decide to change jobs or improve their own conditions.
And the impact, it just rippled through generations, especially, I think, the systematic destruction of Black families. This part is often overlooked, maybe, but the sheer scale, it's devastating.
It really is. And what's astonishing is how that myth of the, benevolent slave owner could even exist alongside this reality. Estimates show that more than half of all enslaved people in the Upper South were separated from a parent or child. Think about that, more than half. And a third of their marriages were destroyed by forced migration. The domestic slave trade alone, just within the U.S., separated nearly half of all enslaved people from spouses and parents.
That's just an incomprehensible number of families broken apart. And that separation, it didn't just stop when slavery legally ended, did it?
No, absolutely not. The trauma just kept going. There's this project, Last Seen, Finding Family After Slavery. It collects and digitizes these information wanted ads, over 900 of them, placed in newspapers by African Americans desperately searching for family members, people lost through sale or escape or during the Civil War.
Wow.
Imagine Nancy Jones. She places an ad in 1886. She's looking for her son, Alan Jones. Last heard from him in 1853. He'd been sold at auction. So 33 years later, she is still searching for her son.
33 years.
Yeah. The sheer persistence of those searches decades after freedom, it just underscores this profound, deep human need for family, for connection, that slavery so violently ripped apart.
Hearing the statistics is one thing, but hearing the stories directly from those who lived through it, that's something else entirely. And that's where the documentation becomes so vital. Our sources highlight a couple of incredible efforts to capture those voices, those images.
Yes, indeed. One of the most significant was the Federal Writers Project, the WPA slave narratives. That was done between 1936 and 1938. They managed to assemble over 2,000 narratives interviews with former enslaved people across 17 states. The whole point was to capture these life histories, taken down as far as possible in the narrator's words, to create this invariable body of unconscious evidence or indirect source material.
So what does an effort like that mean for how we understand this history now?
Well, it means that for the first time, really, and probably the last time given when it happened, a large number of surviving formerly enslaved people were actually permitted to tell their own story in their own way.
Yeah.
Now, were there limitations? Sure. Interviewer bias, maybe leading questions, debates about spelling dialect accurately.
Right.
But the commitment fundamentally was to capture the truth to idiom, the person's natural way of speaking, to make it accessible but still authentic. There's one really compelling example, Henrietta King. She told her story about her jaw being crushed by a whipping. The interviewer initially doubted it.
Doubted it.
Yeah. But later, her physical appearance and how consistently she recounted it, it verified her story.
Mm.
It's a powerful reminder these people were actively trying to preserve their truth against denial.
Words are powerful, but they're not the only way to bear witness. Visuals can hit even harder sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. There was this broadside, Injured Humanity, circulated way back in 1805. Quaker printer Samuel Wood. It was an early abolitionist piece designed specifically to shock readers. It had these vivid little illustrations, vignettes of people being whipped, sold, tortured, families torn apart, and it directly called on Christians to reject with horror the smallest participation in such infernal transactions.
And then fast forward to 1863, and an image emerges that really changes everything for a lot of Northerners.
That would be the photograph of whipped Peter. Just shocking. Peter was an escaped enslaved man, joined the Union Army. During a medical exam in Baton Rouge, he revealed his back, savagely scarred, just crisscrossed with these thick, raised welts, marks from a horrific whipping by an overseer. That image became one of the most widely circulated photos of slavery. It was distributed as these popular little photo cards, carte de visite, and published in Harper's Weekly.
So it literally brought the brutality right into people's living rooms.
Exactly. And what's crucial is how it forced that direct confrontation. Made it impossible to deny for so many who'd maybe only heard, sanitized versions. For many white Northerners who hadn't seen slavery firsthand, Peter's scourged back made the brutality undeniable. It directly contradicted all those Southern claims about enslaved people being treated humanely. Now, the written accounts alongside it sometimes still had racist stereotypes, sure, but the photo itself, just a powerful, wordless indictment. It was even denounced as fake by pro-slavery sympathizers, the Copperheads. They were actively against the Union war effort in emancipation. But they were quickly rebutted. That image just shattered illusions.
As we're going deeper here, it feels important to remember slavery wasn't just an American thing, it was global. And the sources give some perspective on how American slavery may be compared to systems elsewhere.
That's a really crucial point. Yeah. Well, our focus is the American experience. When people talk about the worst slave systems, you often hear about places like Barbados, Jamaica, Saint Domingue, largely because of the sugar plantations. Just hellish labor processes, brutal owner regimes.
What made those places so particularly brutal?
Well, for Barbados, people at the time called it the most hellish locale in the Americas.
Huh.
There are accounts of heads of slaves fixed upon sharp-pointed stakes, their bodies left exposed, just horrific. In Jamaica, you had mosquito-borne diseases, yellow fever, cholera causing horrendous death rates. At one point, the average life expectancy for an enslaved person there was just 4 years. Half are dead by age 20.
4 years.
Yeah.
Connecting that to the bigger picture, it really hammers home that the dehumanization took so many forms. What about other types of forced labor the sources bring up?
Right. They also mention the alluvial gold fields in South America, some of the highest mortality rates there because people spent hours submerged in cold water.
Hmm?
Being a galley slave, Mediterranean, Barbary Coast, that was considered one of the worst fates too. Chained to an oar in these, quote, fetid conditions, bodies just dumped overboard. And then there's the Arab Swahili slave trade. Reports of overland captives who died being cooked and fed to survivors. Male captives often castrated. So while they're all distinct in their specific horrors, the common thread is undeniable. Absolute power given to one group over another just inevitably breeds profound systemic cruelty.
Wow. Okay. We have really covered a lot of ground today, haven't we? A real deep dive from, really debunking those romanticized myths about American slavery to digging into the chilling realities, the Middle Passage, the daily trauma, physical and psychological. We've seen how families were just systematically torn apart and how that desperate search for loved ones went on for decades.
Yeah, and we looked at those invaluable records. The WPA slave narratives, giving voice to the survivors, those powerful abolitionist broadsides, and that just unforgettable photo of whipped Peter. All things that forced the nation, really, to confront very uncomfortable truths. And putting American slavery in that wider global context helps too, seeing those shared threads of brutality across different systems.
So what does this all mean for you listening? It's a lot to take in, but understanding these profound historical truths, it feels essential for understanding where we are now in the present.
And those persistent efforts we talked about to romanticize or deny the brutality. That's not just history revisionism from the past. It's an active force. It continues to shape how we understand things like justice, inequality, collective memory right now. Understanding that ongoing struggle for truth is just as vital, I think, as understanding the history itself.
We really hope this deep dive encourages you to keep exploring these stories, to keep confronting the full truth of the past, however difficult. Thanks so much for joining us.